Yo, 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 what's cracking, everybody? So, today I'm coming in with episode number 2 of Mixing 101. In today's video, we're going to be taking a brief look at Fruity Reverb 2. This is the default reverb plugin inside of FL Studio, and this is what I still use today. Now, Fruity Reverb 2 is definitely not the best reverb plugin out there. I've seen some really crazy ones in my audio and recording class, but it is the go-to when you're first getting started with music production. So you can see I got a nice little beat loaded up right here, and you may recognize this beat from a previous video. Just a simple little trap beat, with a little bit of like West Coast twang to it. It's nothing crazy. I honestly threw it together in like 20 minutes or so. But what I'm going to be using to demonstrate reverb to you guys today is this snare sound. So here is what it sounds like on its own with no effects added. So now I want to add a little bit of reverb onto this sound. And reverb, if you don't know, is short for reverberation. Basically, what the effect does is it's going to make it so whatever sound you put it on sounds like it's being played in a room that has a lot of echo in it. So I'm going to head on over to my effect rack and I'm going to open up Fruity Reverb 2, spelled with 3 E's, not 2. And now without modifying any of the settings at all, just leaving it 100% default, here is what the snare sounds like with Fruity Reverb 2 added to it. So the very first things inside of the plugin that I'm going to draw your attention to are going to be over here on the right hand side. Right here we have a dry slider and a wet slider. These are going to control the volume of both your original sample and the sound of the reverb itself. So if I turn down the dry knob, it's going to make it so my original snare sound gets quieter. If I turn down the wet knob, it's going to make it so the sound of the reverberation gets quieter. Next up, we have the stereo separation. And what this knob is going to do is it's going to change how spread out amongst both of your headphones or both of your speakers your reverb is. Naturally, reverb wants to be spread out. It's supposed to simulate being inside of, like a big ass room. So if you want to really emphasize that spread out, spacious feel, you can turn up the stereo separation to make it so that way it's really wide across your stereo field. By turning the knob to the right, you're going to make it so the reverb is more mono, which means more in the center of the stereo field. By turning the knob to the left, you're going to make it wider and more spacious. The next big important knob that there is inside of this plugin is going to be the decay knob. This is going to alter how long your reverb lasts. So in the upper left hand corner of FL Studio, it's going to display for you what value the decay knob is at, just like it does for any slider or knob that you can mess with inside of the DAW. So you can see as I'm turning it up, it can go really far up there, all the way up to 20 seconds long, which is just absolutely absurd. You'd never really want to have it at this length. And then by turning it back down, it can go all the way down to just 1/10 of a second, which is going to be so short that it's like hardly even noticeable to most people. Generally, in most circumstances, I leave my decay knob somewhere within 1/2 second to 2 seconds. Maybe I'll push it to 2.5 if I really want like a long, stretched out ambient sound. Anything over like 2.5 seconds though is usually just overkill. The next important knobs that I want to tell you about are going to be over here on the left of the plugin. These are your high cuts and your low cuts. Now, if you watched the previous episode on EQ, you should already be pretty familiar with these terms, but if you don't know, basically by turning up the low cut knob, you're making it so that way the reverb has less low frequencies in it. By turning up the high cut knob, you're reducing the amount of high frequencies that are going to be cut out the reverb. It's a little bit weird the way it works in Fruity Reverb 2, but they're basically opposites of one another. Turn up the high cut, and it's going to give you more high frequencies in your reverb. Turn up the low cut, and it's going to be taking out more and more low frequencies. So you can kind of just mess around with those knobs to alter how bright your reverb is going to sound. If you want something a little bit darker and more ambient, maybe turn down the high cut and keep the low cut where it is. If you want something brighter and happier, turn up the high cut and turn up the low cut. The last knobs that mess with the volume or the frequency of the reverb are going to be your bass and your damp knobs. These are kind of just like high cut and low cut V2. However, instead of taking out frequencies, they're boosting frequencies. So by turning up the bass knob, you're going to be boosting how loud the low end of the reverb is. By turning up the damp knob, you're going to be reducing how much the high frequencies of the reverb are being suppressed. And then by turning up the crossover knob right here, you're basically going to be adjusting where the bass multiplication begins. So if your cross knob is at 1000 Hertz, any reverb sounds under 1000 Hertz are going to be being boosted up by the bass knob if you turn it up. If you turn the cross knob down to, let's say, 269 Hertz, everything underneath 269 Hertz is going to be boosted up. Those knobs are a little bit more complicated. I don't use them as often, but it's still useful to know about. So those are all of the knobs that are going to adjust the volume and the frequency of the reverb. You have your dry slider, your wet slider, and your stereo separation knob, and those are going to be your more volume-oriented controls. Whereas your high cut, low cut, and bass and damp knobs are going to be more focused on changing the frequency range of your reverb. Now I'm going to move into talking about the things that are going to actually alter the way the simulated room of the reverb sounds. Because now you have to keep in mind that this isn't just some random simulated effect. We're trying to recreate a real life room. So how we would do that would be by adjusting the size in the early reflection sliders. These are essentially going to change what kind of room you're in. Do you want your snare drum to sound like it's being played in a tiny metal closet, or do you want it to sound like it's being played in the Sydney Opera House? Altering things such as the early reflections, the diffusion, the speed, the mod, and most importantly, the size knob are going to change all of these factors. The hardest one to explain by far is the early reflection slider, but in short, early reflections just mean the very first reverberations that you hear when you play a sound inside of a room. So it's going to kind of depend based on the plugin, and I don't know exactly which function it serves inside of Fruity Reverb 2, but it's either going to make it so that way the early reflections are closer to the sound source, or it's going to make it so that way the early reflections are just louder, or it'll make it so that way there's more early reflections. Moving this up is going to do one of those three things, and which one it does just kind of depends on the plugin you're using. But in the most simplistic way possible, as it was explained to me by my audio and recording teacher, if you turn it up, it's going to make the room sound like it's bigger. That's usually what it's going to do, but it can vary from plugin to plugin. Then we have the size knob, which is pretty self-explanatory. You can see it altering the size of the room that we're in the little visualizer. The diffusion knob is going to either increase or lower the amount of walls in the room, which will make your reverb sound a lot tangier the less walls there are, or it'll sound a lot smoother and more full the more walls there are. The mod knob is ridiculously hard to explain, but basically when you turn it up, it kind of makes your reverb sound a bit smoother, but if you turn it up too far, it kind of adds a little bit of like this unpleasantness to it. Makes it sound almost a little metallic, I don't know. It's something you can mess around with, but it's truthfully not something I use very often. And then the speed knob is just connected to the modification knob, so it's basically going to adjust like how quick the reverb is being modified by this other knob. This mid and side button has to do with stereo, but truthfully, I've never used it a day in my life, so I just know it kind of changes the way the reverb processes stereo sound, but I don't know in what way, if I'm being honest. I mean, I've never used it. And then finally, a really fun one to mess around with is this delay knob. This will make it so that way your reverb is offset, which is kind of cool. And you can adjust this to the tempo by hitting this little button right next to it. So I'll demonstrate this for you guys. I'll let you hear how this sounds real quick. It's a little bit unorthodox to use it. You're not going to be using this effect all the time, but it's cool if you just want to add like a unique effect to your reverb, And syncing it up with the tempo is really useful because if you don't do that, you're kind of just guessing how many milliseconds you want it to be at, so it's not super effective. And then finally, inside of Fruity Reverb, if you want to, you can go up here to the presets section, and there's a couple little presets that you can choose from. There's not a whole bunch, but you can click through these and it'll offer a couple different sounds, but truthfully, I never really use them. I kind of just leave it on default, and I think it's a lot more valuable to know how to actually modify the knobs yourself rather than just relying on presets. especially with an effect like reverb, where so much of it is based off of your ears and what you think sounds good in the mix. As for when you would want to use reverb, like I said, it's kind of up to you. There is the process of putting your reverb on a bus track, so that way you have a little bit more control over the volume, but that's a bit more of an advanced technique that I'm not going to cover in this video. More often than not, unless you're going for like a real professional studio recording, the wet slider will do you justice. It'll work just fine. And I'd say probably the most common beginner mistake that you can make with reverb is putting it on everything. You do not need to have reverb on every single freaking sound in your song, all right? It's a little bit tedious if you do that, and it makes everything sound super washed out and kind of bad. Or maybe not, you know? Maybe you like it. I don't know. It's up to you, really. But I mean, if you want like a clean, professional sounding song, you really only want to use reverb to accent certain sounds. Maybe you put a little touch of reverb on the snare drum. Maybe you put a little bit of reverb on the vocals, or like a certain melody that you want to be more ambient. Whenever you use reverb, it should always be for a good reason. You don't want to just be like, oh, this sample sounds shitty. Let me put some reverb on it to try to fix it. Let me just drop it on there and see if it improves the sound quality. Spoiler, it won't. All right. Pick good sounds, use reverb to accent your good sounds to make them into better sounds. Don't throw it on everything in an attempt to make it sound cooler when really you're just using bad sounds. So yeah, that pretty much wraps up this video. That is your little introduction to Fruity Reverb 2. Honestly, all of the most important knobs that I talked about are at the start of the video. A lot of the stuff that I covered at the end really briefly is just stuff that you might use once in a while. Either way though, I really hope you enjoyed the video and you learned something from this. Hopefully you could take these tips and apply them into your music if you've been struggling to figure out how to use reverb effectively. Leave a like if you would like, and I will catch you next time. Foo.